5. Lower than 50%, but not very low. Technically agnostic, but leaning towards atheism. I don't know whether God exists, but I'm inclined to be skeptical.
6. Very low probability, but short of 0. De facto atheist. I cannot know for certain, but I think God is very improbable, and I live my life on the assumption that he is not there.
And 7. Strong atheist. I know there is no God with the same conviction as Jung knows there is one.
I'd be surprised to meet many people in Category 7, but I include it for symmetry with Category 1, which is well populated. It is in the nature of faith that one is capable, like Jung, of holding a belief without adequate reason to do so. Jung also believed that particular books on his shelf spontaneously exploded with a loud bang. Atheists do not have faith, and reason alone could not propel one to total conviction that anything definitely does not exist. Hence, Category 7 is in practice rather emptier than its opposite number, Category 1, which has many devoted inhabitants. I count myself in Category 6, but leaning towards 7. I am agnostic only to the extent that I am agnostic about fairies at the bottom of the garden. The spectrum of probabilities works well for TAP, temporary agnosticism, in practice. It is superficially tempting to place PAP, permanent agnosticism in principle, in the middle of the spectrum with a 50% probability of God's existence. But this is not correct. PAP agnostics aver that we cannot say anything one way or the other on the question of whether or not God exists. The question for PAP agnostics is in principle unanswerable, and they should strictly refuse to place themselves anywhere on the spectrum of probabilities. The fact that I cannot know whether your red is the same as my green doesn't make the probability 50%. The proposition on offer is too meaningless to be dignified with a probability. Nevertheless, it is a common error, which we shall meet again, to leap from the premise that the question of God's existence is in principle unanswerable to the conclusion that his existence and his non-existence are equiprobable. Another way to express that error is in terms of the burden of proof, and in this form it is pleasingly demonstrated by Bertrand Russell's parable of the celestial teapot.
Many orthodox people speak as though it were the business of skeptics to disprove received dogmas, rather than of dogmatists to prove them. This is, of course, a mistake. If I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars there is a china teapot revolving about the Sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on to say that, since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. If, however, the existence of such a teapot were affirmed in ancient books, taught as the sacred truth every Sunday, and instilled into the minds of children at school, hesitation to believe in its existence would become a mark of eccentricity, and entitle the doubter to the attentions of the psychiatrist in an enlightened age, or of the inquisitor in an earlier time.
We would not waste time saying so, because nobody, so far as I know, worships teapots. But if pressed, we would not hesitate to declare our strong belief that there is positively no orbiting teapot. Yet strictly we should all be teapot agnostics. We cannot prove for sure that there is no celestial teapot. In practice, we move away from teapot agnosticism towards a-teapotism. A friend who was brought up a Jew and still observes the Sabbath and other Jewish customs out of loyalty to his heritage describes himself as a tooth fairy agnostic. He regards God as no more probable than the tooth fairy. You can't disprove either hypothesis, and both are equally improbable. He is an atheist to exactly the same large extent that he is an a-fairyist, and agnostic about both to the same small extent. Russell's teapot, of course, stands for an infinite number of things whose existence is conceivable and cannot be disproved. That great American lawyer Clarence Darrow said, "I don't believe in God as I don't believe in Mother Goose." The journalist Andrew Muller is of the opinion that pledging yourself to any particular religion is no more or less weird than choosing to believe that the world is rhombus-shaped and born through the cosmos in the pincers of two enormous green lobsters called Esmeralda and Keith. A philosophical favourite is the invisible, intangible, inaudible unicorn, disproof of which is attempted yearly by the children at Camp Quest.
Camp Quest takes the American institution of the summer camp in an entirely admirable direction. Unlike other summer camps that follow a religious or scouting ethos, Camp Quest, founded by Edwin and Helen Kagan in Kentucky, is run by secular humanists, and the children are encouraged to think skeptically for themselves while having a very good time with all the usual outdoor activities.
A popular deity on the internet at present, and as undisprovable as Yahweh or any other, is the flying spaghetti monster who, many claim, has touched them with his noodly appendage. I am delighted to see that the gospel of the flying spaghetti monster has now been published as a book, to great acclaim. I haven't read it myself, but who needs to read a gospel when you just know it's true? By the way, it had to happen. A great schism has already occurred, resulting in the Reformed Church of the flying spaghetti monster. The point of all these way-out examples is that they are undisprovable, yet nobody thinks the hypothesis of their existence is on an even footing with the hypothesis of their non-existence. Russell's point is that the burden of proof rests with the believers, not the non-believers. Mine is the related point that the odds in favour of the teapot, spaghetti monster, Esmeralda and Keith, unicorn, etc., are not equal to the odds against. The fact that orbiting teapots and tooth fairies are undisprovable is not felt by any reasonable person to be the kind of fact that settles any interesting argument. None of us feels an obligation to disprove any of the millions of far-fetched things that a fertile or facetious imagination might dream up. I have found it an amusing strategy, when asked whether I'm an atheist, to point out that the questioner is also an atheist, when considering Zeus, Apollo, Amun-Ra, Mithras, Baal, Thor, Wotan, the golden calf, and the flying spaghetti monster. I just go one god further.
All of us feel entitled to express extreme skepticism to the point of outright disbelief, except that in the case of unicorns, tooth fairies, and the gods of Greece, Rome, Egypt, and the Vikings, there is, nowadays, no need to bother. In the case of the Abrahamic God, however, there is a need to bother, because a substantial proportion of the people with whom we share the planet do believe strongly in his existence. Russell's teapot demonstrates that the ubiquity of belief in God, as compared with belief in celestial teapots, does not shift the burden of proof in logic, although it may seem to shift it as a matter of practical politics. That you cannot prove God's non-existence is accepted and trivial, if only in the sense that we can never absolutely prove the non-existence of anything. What matters is not whether God is disprovable, he isn't, but whether his existence is probable. That is another matter. Some undisprovable things are sensibly judged far less probable than other undisprovable things. There's no reason to regard God as immune from consideration along the spectrum of probabilities. And there is certainly no reason to suppose that just because God can be neither proved nor disproved, his probability of existence is 50%. On the contrary, as we shall see.
Noma. Just as Thomas Huxley bent over backwards to pay lip service to completely impartial agnosticism, right in the middle of my 7-stage spectrum, theists do the same thing from the other direction, and for an equivalent reason. The theologian Alistair McGrath makes it the central point of his book, Dawkins is God, Genes, Memes, and the Origin of Life. Indeed, after his admirably fair summary of my scientific works, it seems to be the only point in rebuttal that he has to offer, the undeniable but ignominiously weak point that you cannot disprove the existence of God. On page after page, as I read McGrath, I found myself scribbling teapot in the margin. Again invoking T.H. Huxley, McGrath says,